This is my new room temperature filterless cherry shrimp jar. It uses an aquasoil substrate, dragonstone hardscape and a bunch of different plants for natural water purification. It's surprisingly easy to set up, and here's how you can build your own. Here's the supplies I used for this setup, with some Fluval Stratum for substrate, the actual jar, a USB light and the dragonstone. Many different plants will thrive in this type of shrimp jar, but I'll cover the specific choices I've went with in the planting section later in the video. I prefer to use these larger 6.5 litre or 1.7 US gallon jars, but this setup can work well with smaller jars if needed. The additional space allows for more plants, creating more grazing spots for the shrimp and supports a larger shrimp colony. I chose to use Fluval Stratum as a substrate because it's cheap and easy to find in shops, and it's worked well in every single other aquarium I've used it in. Unlike a Walstad shrimp jar, which needs both a nutrient layer and a capping layer, Fluval Stratum is ready to use right out of the bag, so I added around 2 inches of it to the jar. Then I gave the jar a shake to angle the substrate to try and create a depth illusion for later in the build, but this is an optional step. Next I added the dragonstone, selecting 3 pieces with interesting detail that will fit well in the jar to make the foreground, midground and background areas. Using aquasoil lets me press the stones into the substrate without worrying about nitrogen compound spikes, which could be an issue with the Walstad version of this jar. Here's a top-down view of the jar at this stage, showing the different zones I've built into it. I really like the contrast between the dark substrate and the brighter stones, and I might try a larger version of this setup in an aquarium in the future. After slightly tweaking the position of the stones, I added some tissue to take the force of the water, and then I filled the jar. For lighting, I'm using a Haiga LED clip-on light. I did purchase this with my own money, but Haiga have gave me a discount code for 5% off and free shipping for USA residents, which I'll link to in the description. Here's the jar with the light on, and I'll be releasing a video later this month about shrimp jar lighting, as this is one of the best lights I've found for this type of setup. I decided to try and cycle the jar before planting it, so I added some tap water conditioner to remove chlorine and chloramines that could harm the beneficial bacteria in archaea. Then I dosed the jar with Dr. Tim's ammonia solution to simulate a bioload and kickstart the cycle, following the instructions on the label, and only a small amount of it is needed for a jar of this size. Then I turned the light off during the initial cycle to reduce the algae growth, and I left the jar to do its thing. Here's some B-roll of Neocaridina shrimp while I quickly explain what's actually happening in the jar at this stage. So the main focus is to cycle the jar and establish a safe environment for my cherry shrimp. The ammonia solution that I added acts as a stand-in for shrimp waste, providing food for beneficial bacteria and archaea colonies that will populate the various surfaces in the jar over the next month. These microorganisms convert the ammonia into nitrite, which is also toxic to shrimp, but that also serves as a food source for an additional beneficial bacteria colony that will develop over the next month or 2. Eventually, this second colony of bacteria will convert nitrite into nitrate, which can still be harmful in very high amounts, but it's also a food for plants, so the live plants I'll add will help to keep it in check. Since I'm using aquasoil, there's also a second process happening in the jar. Aquasoil products release hydrogen ions into the water, which in turn lowers the pH and water hardness, potentially causing problems for cherry shrimp. Some of the more expensive aquasoils can buffer the water for months, but in my experience, Fluval Stratum releases most of its ions within the first month or 2, and the buffering effect starts to drop off quickly. Because cherry shrimp prefer harder water, I'm aiming to use up as many of the hydrogen ions as possible while the jar cycles, dealing with 2 problems at once. Even with ambient light, this cycling time will let some biofilm build up on the surfaces in the jar that will also act as food for the cherry shrimp later. So fast forward to day 36, and my test kit shows that the jar can process a 1 ppm dose of ammonia to 0 ppm of ammonia and nitrite within 24 hours. This should be more than enough for cherry shrimp, so it's time to plant the jar. I ordered some Ludwigia Palustris green, some Staurogyne Repens and a tub of Eleocharis Parvula online, and then I took some cuttings of Rotala Rotundifolia, Limnophila Sessiliflora and water lettuce from my other tanks. Eleocharis Parvula is a native plant to the UK, so it should be fine fine in this room temperature jar through the winter and shouldn't give me any issues. Its short maximum height makes it ideal for a foreground plant, and in my experience, shrimp like to graze on the algae and biofilm that grows on its leaves in a similar way they'll graze on it on moss. Planting it in the aquasoil was actually easier than I thought it would, and I didn't have any issues with it lifting out of the substrate. Next, I added some Staurogyne Repens that's native to South America. I am a little concerned about this one's performance over the winter months, but temperatures shouldn't drop below 18 degrees Celsius, so I'm hoping it'll be fine. This midground plant fits well in smaller setups like shrimp jars and tends to bush out quickly. Planting it was also easy, and again I didn't have problems with it lifting out of the substrate. Limnophila Sessiliflora is a very fast growing plant from Southeast and East Asia. The Gulf Stream causes Northwest Europe to have milder winters than some of its native regions such as Japan, so if it can handle an outdoors winter in Japan, it should be able to handle a British winter indoors in this little shrimp jar. Limnophila is an absolute beast too, and these 3 stems should easily be enough to support the natural filtration requirements of a large shrimp colony. Then I added some Ludwigia Palustris, which is also a native plant to the UK, so it shouldn't have any problems in this room temperature jar. I placed it behind the Limnophila because I do prefer the look of the Limnophila's leaves over the Ludwigia. Then I added some Rotala Rotundifolia, which is another plant that's native to Southeast Asia and Japan. Northern India and Japan both experience winter temperatures that dip below my fish room's ambient temperature, so it should be fine. I also successfully kept Rotala Rotundifolia in my very first shrimp jar last year through the British winter, so it should be fine. I did place the Rotala towards the front of the background area because its leaves can develop a nice pink hue under the right light conditions, so I do like that little touch of pink. This is what the jar looks like at this stage with all of the submerged plants in place. Finally, I added some water lettuce, and this is an invasive species in the UK, so it should be able to live in this jar throughout the winter without any problems. I will probably remove the water lettuce in a few months, but for now it's just adding that extra layer of protection against toxin buildup that could harm the shrimp. I really don't think floating plants are essential for shrimp jars because shrimp's bioload is so low, and with this specific setup with aquasoil there's really not much ammonia leaking out of the substrate. So fast forward one day and this is what the jar looks like, and thankfully all of the plants are still in place. Fluval Stratum is a lot lighter than some other popular aquasoil, so I was a little worried about some of the plants lifting out of it overnight. As you can see, everything is still where it should be, and with any luck the plants will start to root in place and grow over the coming weeks. So jumping ahead to day 43, and my test kit shows that the water parameters are still good in the tank, so it's time to add some cherry shrimp. I have a thriving colony of shrimp in one of my aquariums, so I'll be transferring a few of them from here into the jar. Since the water parameters in the aquarium and the jar are almost identical, there's no need to drip acclimate the shrimp between the two. I started my yellow Neocaridina shrimp jar with only 5 shrimp, and there's around 30 in there now, so I'm aiming to do the same with this one. As expected, the shrimp quickly settled in and started to look for food in their new home. Remember, the stem plants in here are cuttings from another tank, so they'll have plenty of biofilm on them for the shrimp to eat, and some biofilm should also have built up during the cycling process. Still, to encourage breeding, I added a single granule of fluval bug bites, as I find that Neocaridina shrimp tend to reproduce more frequently with protein in their diet. I only added 1 granule because there's just a few shrimp in the jar at the moment. I did try and place it as close to the foreground as possible so I'd be able to record the shrimp eating, but as you can see it landed in the only place in the foreground that doesn't have line of sight for the camera. Still, after around 15 minutes I checked back on the jar and one of the cherry shrimp had found it and was having a little snack. So fast forward to day 55, and that's today at the time of recording this video, and the shrimp seem to have settled in without issue. I have seen 3 shrimp molts now, so it does suggest that the shrimp are able to molt in this jar's water parameters without problem. The jar is currently getting 6 hours of light per day, and this should be fine for all of the plants in here. I'm adding a single bug bite granule 3 times per week, and I'm checking the tank's ammonia and pH after each feeding day. Thankfully the ammonia levels are sticking at 0 ppm, and there is still a slight buffering effect from the aquasoil with it reducing the tank's pH, but slight water changes over the coming weeks should easily be able to balance that. I'm 90% sure I've seen a buried female carrying eggs in here, but I haven't been able to get a clear look at her or record any footage. I would guess that she was already pregnant before I moved moved her over from the aquarium, but it's a nice kickstart to the population in this jar. I'm just going to let this jar evolve naturally over the coming months, and I'm going to be leaving all of the low grade shrimp in there just to see what happens with the population. My current plan is to only add small amounts of food 3 days a week and some water to counter the evaporation, and I'm only going to remove excess plant mass to prevent it from taking over the jar. As usual, I will touch on this jar in my monthly fish room update video, but I'll also provide more in-depth videos and updates on how it's performing every 3 months or so. Water temperature does seem to be averaging around 19 degrees Celsius in the jar right now, so I doubt it's going to drop much more than this over the winter months, so with any luck there won't be any major problems. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. Hopefully it's been helpful. These jars really are a great way to get into the hobby, and they're not as difficult as a lot of people think. There are some affiliate links to some of the products I've used in the description, as well as the higher discount code for US residents. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a good day.